Hi, my name is Jerry, I'm a fantasy author, and having finally settled into my new apartment, I am here with a brand new series about characterization. In a previous video, I said that world building is one of the most powerful tools at a writer's disposal, and that is because the title of the most powerful tool arguably goes to today's subject. Your story can have the most elaborate world building and most intricate plot anyone's ever written. If there isn't a compelling set of characters for the reader to root for or against, you're going to have a disproportionately more difficult time keeping their attention. And that's honestly not too surprising. Despite what the internet will sometimes have you believe, humans are fundamentally empathetic creatures. We instinctively seek connections with other people, whether real or fictional, and we form much more lasting memories of experiences with a strong emotional association. The example that I keep coming back to is when I was selling my books at a convention and someone who had previously bought them came up to my stand, and when I asked for her opinion, she said, "I didn't always agree with the characters, but they made me feel things, and that's what matters." Which brings me to my first point. You see, there's a reason I used some very deliberate phrasing just now when I said that your story needs a compelling set of characters. The importance of characterization is widely known and discussed, and as such, you will find any number of advice videos or articles out there telling you that your characters need to be likable and relatable. And while those are definitely two of the ways a character can be compelling, they are not the only ones. Already as far back as the early 19th century, Jane Austen famously said that when she sat down to write Emma, she purposefully set out to create a character that only she would like. And then later authors would take this to increasing extremes. If you read books like Double Indemnity, The Cocktail Waitress, The Last Chapter, or really any number of thrillers in the noir genre, you will often find that the protagonists of these books are cold-blooded frauds and even murderers who you are absolutely not supposed to root for, and when they do get their comeuppance, it is 100% fair and deserved. Or, in a more personal example, when I was working on my first book, the moment where I genuinely started to think I might have something good on my hands was when I sent out my manuscript to editors and beta readers, and each of my four very different main characters managed to become somebody's favorite and somebody else's least favorite. Or, in another personal example, this time on the flip side, I remember reading this one book titled The Wheel of Darkness and very quickly becoming disillusioned because the main character is such a poster child for that very 2000s archetype of hyper-competent 30-year-old man who's too cool for society to handle, and I found him absolutely insufferable. Meanwhile, all of the normie side characters were just the actual human beings, and I ended up empathizing with them so much for having to put up with this arrogant piece of work that I basically kept reading for their sake and just cherished every scene where these people got to interact between themselves away from the protagonist. The point I'm trying to drive home with all of these examples is that different characters can be compelling to different readers for different reasons, and not always the one the author intended. So what are some of those reasons? Well, as I just said, it is absolutely possible to write a protagonist that the reader isn't meant to empathize with, but there are definitely shades and nuances to this. For example, the protagonist in Double Indemnity is pretty much devoid of personality besides being horny for the femme fatale, and the story takes an almost clinically matter-of-fact approach to his moral decline. By contrast, the protagonist of The Cocktail Waitress, from the same author, starts out as sympathetic, and then the reader gradually loses their goodwill as she does more and more reprehensible things for what she keeps telling herself is her son's sake, but are really just very self-serving interests. The last chapter is particularly interesting because the main character in that one starts out as a struggling author, which would be a sympathetic position, except we very quickly find out that the reason he's struggling is because he's incredibly pretentious and conceited. And yet, at the end of the first act, when he manages to pull off the fraud that sets everything in motion, The scene is written with such a sincerely triumphant tone that you just cannot help but share in the character's satisfaction, at least for a moment, which was a really brilliant move on the author's part, because that emotional high is the perfect setup for the absolute nosedive the character takes in the rest of the book. So in many of these cases, we as the readers don't find these characters compelling because we relate to them, but rather it's out of a sense of morbid curiosity to see just how low this person will stoop and how they keep wriggling their way out of problems and how, if at all, they get what's coming to them. The thing you need to keep in mind, though, is that this takes a lot of intentionality, and it's a very precarious line to walk, awakening this sort of fascination in the reader rather than outright repelling them. So while it is definitely possible, most of the time, yes, you will be trying to create characters that are likable and/or relatable. The two terms are often used synonymously, but there is a distinction. A likable person is someone whose company you would enjoy, whereas a relatable person is one who you can identify with. And this idea is also something of a spectrum. On one end, the most literal interpretation of relatability is when the character is facing the exact same mundane problems that the reader does. Going to school, going to work, dealing with bosses, dealing with family, paying rent, etc. In genres like slice of life or contemporary drama, the entire story revolves around these relatable, mundane issues, but there can also be stories that are more extraordinary, and these mundane elements are injected to keep it grounded. A less literal interpretation of relatability is when the problems faced by the character are similar to the readers in a more abstract sense. So instead of going to actually school or work or dealing with family, it's more about fitting in a new environment or working out personal issues or finding your passion. This is what can allow stories in speculative or historical settings to feel relatable. And for one example of the historical case, I can recommend that you check out Three Men in a Boat by Jerome K. Jerome. It's a collection of anecdotes from, I think, 1890 or somewhere around then, which I first read in high school. And even as a 15-year-old in the year 2000, I nearly choked laughing because I recognized every single one of the situations and the people that this Victorian author was describing. Thirdly, relatability can also mean that the problems faced by the character are completely alien to the reader, but the way in which the character responds to them is recognizable. A classic case of this would be Arthur Dent in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where the entire hook of the story is that this average person is met with increasingly absurd situations and responds to them in a very average person way. Or, to once again give a less literal example, this might veer into personal opinion territory, but in A Song of Ice and Fire, the main appeal of the character of Tyrion Lannister, at least to me, was that in this entire world of war and dragons and political intrigue, he's the guy who just wants to live and be left alone. And you know what? As someone who's past 40, I feel that. Now, besides likability, relatability, and morbid fascination, another way in which a character can be compelling is through admiration, aka if it's a cool person doing cool things. And while the word cool itself is very recent, the idea of a character who's meant to be admired more than anything else is the farthest thing from that. And as a matter of fact, you probably have learned that the original ancient Greek concept of hero didn't have any moral connotations of selflessness or nobility, but rather it simply referred to a man who did great things, often for completely self-serving reasons. Now, in modern times, we do still have the archetype of the action hero who represents physical strength and prowess, but we have also developed a different kind of character whose impressiveness is more cerebral. The authors of The Wheel of Darkness were definitely going for this kind of character, but herein lies the caveat, which admittedly is once again something of a matter of taste, as with so many things in writing. The gist of it is that the feats and abilities of these characters often push the limits of believability, even when they're supposed to be realistic. This in and of itself isn't necessarily a problem, that's kind of what fiction is all about. The problem arises when this reaches a point where the reader becomes acutely aware that the only reason the character keeps getting away with doing what they're doing is because the author wants them to. And when this kind of protagonist privilege is paired with a huge dose of confidence, that confidence can end up feeling unearned, which in turn makes the character feel obnoxious. Again, a lot of this is very subjective. I'm just putting this out as a point for you to consider. Now, one way to prevent or at least mitigate this problem is to make your character a little bit less perfect by relying on another often repeated and often misunderstood concept, which is vulnerability. I'm just going to be completely straightforward with this. Vulnerable doesn't mean sad. The idea behind vulnerability is that we humans, being the social animals that we are, instinctively adapt our behavior to our surroundings and develop a sort of persona that helps us deal with the world on a day-to-day basis. Now, while in some extreme cases, this persona is very deliberately manufactured and radically different from someone's actual personality, in most cases, it's completely instinctive and the person might not even realize they're doing it. But either way, it always acts as a sort of filter that determines what we share with the world and how we do it. And vulnerability is simply the act of at least temporarily letting go of this filter and allowing our deepest self to be exposed directly to the outside world. And yes, this can mean sadness, but it can mean a whole lot of other things. It can manifest as sharing hopes, desires, or trauma, or expressing anything from fear and insecurity to affection to even joy, as long as it's completely sincere and unaffected by the character's preconceived notions of how the world might react. To once again give a personal example, some of you might know that I am a trained pastry chef, and as such, I had to complete an apprenticeship. And during my apprenticeship, at one point, I got into a really bad fight with a coworker. Not gonna waste time on details. The point is, we both left work being upset with each other, and so when we came back the next morning and it was just the two of us in the kitchen, the tension was palpable. We didn't talk to each other, we didn't look at each other, we didn't go near each other. We set up camp on opposite sides of the kitchen island and got to work with our heads down. During this whole time, the radio was on, as it always was in the kitchen, and the morning zoo show was playing, and one of the hosts made a joke that was so very bad and stupid that I just couldn't help but crack a smile. And as I did so, I looked up, and across the kitchen island, my coworker was also smiling and looking up. And in that moment, 90% of the awkwardness was just swept out of the room because whether or not we wanted to, both of us temporarily let down that harsh exterior that we put up specifically for that situation on that day, and we were just two people smiling at a bad joke. It didn't magically fix our conflict, and I still never want to work with that person again, but at the very least, it broke the ice enough that we could start talking and get through the day. And this segues into the last point I want to touch on in this video, because I have a sneaking suspicion that there's a non-zero percentage of you out there who is suddenly very interested in learning more about my coworker. And, well, you're not going to, but it does highlight how this person suddenly became interesting to you, not as a person unto themselves, but rather as someone who was in a conflict with me. And in a similar fashion, a fictional character can also become compelling, less on their own merits and more because of their relationship with other characters in the same story. But this does come with its own risks. Again, when I was working on my first book, I specifically molded my main characters with the intent of having them act as foils for one another, and for the main appeal of the story to be how they clash and how they eventually resolve their differences. And one of the criticisms that I've heard from multiple people is that because the characters start out in completely disjointed threads, and it takes a couple of chapters for them to meet up and start interacting, the first part of the book has felt a bit slow for some people. So if you have similar plans, then I can recommend that you learn from my case and really put in that extra effort and extra thought to make sure that your characters truly can stand on their own and don't feel incomplete without the others around. So, what do you think? Was any of that useful? Was there something I missed? Was there something I should have talked more about? By all means, let me know in the comments below. I should be back with a more consistent posting schedule, although I will be going on vacation this week, so we'll see how that shakes out. But either way, I hope to see you next time, and until then, stay tuned.